Welcome to Bungalows for Bachelors. Today we are going to learn about some insulation so that we can cover up the plumbing and all the stuff we got in our walls now and move on to getting this house closer to being done. We're presuming that we passed whatever inspections we did, whatever inspections we had for all the plumbing and HVAC and everything. So, what is insulation? Generally speaking, it is the materials that are added to a wall assembly to slow the rate of heat loss through conduction. Let's be very specific about that. So, what types of heat transfer do we have? Well, generally speaking, there are three. The first one is conduction. Conduction is transfer of heat through direct physical contact. So, if there is a hot burner and I touch it with my hand is absorbing the heat from that burner through conduction. That would not be fun, but that's how that would work. Convection would be if there's a hot burner and I blow a fan over that hot burner and I feel the warm air from the fan, the warm air from the air blowing over that hot burner, that air now heats my hand. That's convection. So that's transfer through fluid movement. Now, air is a fluid. It's not a liquid, but it is a fluid. And anytime we're using fluids to transfer heat, that's called convection. And the third type is called radiation. This is transfer of heat through electromagnetic energy in the form of photons. This is pretty sciencey and pretty heady, but the basic premise is everything that is a body that is not 0 degrees Kelvin and has no heat at all emits radiation. So our bodies emit radiation. This is why thermal cameras and stuff like that can pick up human, they pick up human warm bodies, right? Because the whole premise is these cameras have been not trained. They've been programmed to pick up a certain range of radiation, right? So as humans, we emit radiation. When you put 50 people in a room and have, close all the doors, the reason the room warms up because there's a bunch of people radiating heat into the room. So that is radiation. And the main thing to think about with radiation is going to be the sun and sources of like heat or light, like your lights in your house. That's going to be basically the two places. If you have open flame in your house too, that would emit radiation for sure. Like when you stand maybe a few feet away from a fire where you're not, obviously your hands aren't in the fire, but you can feel the heat from the fire. That's because the combustion reaction that's happening in the flames is causing radiation energy to be sent out around itself. So that's what you're feeling is you're feeling radiation. Those are the three types of heat. All right, three types of heat transfer. Sorry. So conduction is what we can stop with the insulation. So convection, transfer through fluid movement, right? Well, the fluid is the air in the house. And if we build a tight house, then we don't have a convection problem. If we contain all the air, then basically the air is not flowing through our walls. We don't want it to do that. So we fixed the convection problem. And radiation, well, we're not going to really lose heat from radiation. We might gain heat from radiation, and we can deal with that in other ways. But insulation is specifically about conduction. It's supposed to be a physical block from the outside air being warm, those air particles coming into contact with the house, and it's going to warm up the siding or the brick. And then that siding is going to warm up the house wrap. The house wrap is going to warm up the sheeting. The sheeting is going to want to warm up the wall. And all of that heat's going to be moving through the wall, right? So when it comes into contact with the insulation is going to still have the heat pass through it, but it's going to slow that process down a lot. That's the whole point. So types of insulation. Well, the general one that most people know about is fiberglass. It's the pink fluffy stuff that you see. Fiberglass insulation is usually around R2.5 to 3.5 per inch. And the whole R value thing is basically, again, it's getting into heat transfer science and stuff like that. We won't talk too much about that. But the basic premise is the higher the R value, the slower the heat will transfer through the material. So a high R value is a good thing. Low R value is a bad thing when in terms of wanting to insulate your house. So fiberglass, it's usually fairly inexpensive comparatively speaking, but it is got the R 2.5 to 3.5 range. And the reason some of these are ranges is because different brands make things slightly differently and claim different numbers, and sometimes numbers change over time. So it's it's not a perfect science, but that's the basic premise. And of course, the other premise is if you're gonna, let's say, put a fiberglass bat in a wall and you have 3.5 inches of wall space. Well, if you fill all 3.5, they're going to claim that you're going to gain like R13 from installing that bat. However, if you've got a wire or something or other stuff in there and you install it wrong and it gets squished and you compress it, you're not going to get that insulation value because it needs to be fluffy and fill up the whole space. So that's why the ranges are kind of ranges exactly. So mineral wool is another kind of like fibery material, but it's made out of a different material. It's made out of mineral wool instead of fiberglass. And its premise is that it is just a better product. It's more resilient. It is fireproof. It is much more fire resistant than fiberglass. It's better at sound insulation. It's better at heat insulation, right? It's got up to R4.3 per inch, around there somewhere, right? So it's better at insulating. Of course, it will be more expensive, but it's better at insulating. There's blown-in cellulose, which is normally the kind of stuff you'd see in someone's attic in a regular tract home or a regular home that most people live in, because it's usually the most cost-effective way to do a large amount of insulation fairly quickly. Is they basically get up there at the attic access and blow it all in with a big fan and a big tube. The photo on the right is showing the blown-in cellulose example, and that all just hangs out loosely up there. And that's usually about R3.5 per inch. And then there's spray foams. All right, so spray foams, there's two types. There's closed cell and open cell. The basic premise is you're going to take a gun, and the gun is going to mix part A and part B monomers, and monomers that's like plastic. Plastic is a polymer, but it's going to mix two monomers that are basically, when you put them together, they create a chemical reaction that makes them a polymer, that makes them the plastic foam that they are, right? And while it's doing that, the spraying mechanism is injecting. It's not injecting. I believe the chemical reaction produces a bunch of air bubbles and stuff like that itself. So that's the foam science is very interesting. But the basic premise is you're going to mix part A, part B. It's going to have a chemical reaction, expand, and create this foam. Now, the two different types, closed cell and open cell. So think of open cell like the sponge you'd have on your kitchen sink, the yellow sponge that you use to, soak up a bunch of water, wash your dishes, and then you squeeze it and you can squeeze all the water out. That's open cell foam. So it's not going to be like the sponge in that you squeeze water out and stuff like that, but the cell structure of all these bubbles are open in that fluids and air and anything can pass through it, right? So if you have water vapor, usually specifically is what I'm referring to, right? So air can effectively pass through this foam if need be because all the cells are open. And then there's closed cell foam. And if you've ever had to install a can of maybe grate foam or something like that, there's kind of like a expanding polyurethane or anything like that. So you shoot this out of a little can, it comes out yellow, it expands, and then it hardens. It gets very, very hard. So closed cell foam is much more rigid, much more durable. It's better at insulating. It doesn't let air or vapor pass through it because all those little bubbles are closed bubbles. They're sealed. So it also traps air very well. So a lot of people will basically not pay a ton of effort into air sealing their house because they know they're going to use closed cell spray foam. And that when you spray every cell everywhere, it does a pretty good job of trapping all the air in the house, right? So that's pretty cool. It's a very good product. It insulates very high value per inch, R6 to 7 per inch, depending on the brand and things like that. So it is expensive, but it allows you to insulate a lot per inch which usually means you're going to use less inches. So it's a great thing to use if you need a tight space or like a vaulted ceiling where maybe you don't your structure's not as thick and you need to fit more insulation in a less space thing. I could use it for that, but it's a great product for lots of reasons. And then there's rigid foam boards. So the rigid foam boards are usually used in situations where you'd put it maybe on the exterior of a wall. Some products like Huber has basically sheathing panels where there's rigid insulation built into the back of the sheathing panel, so it's been bonded. So that's basically what, it's going to go outside of walls. Occasionally you'll see it but put up below concrete, but like you'll put it down below before pouring a concrete floor or something like that to insulate a concrete floor if you're really fancy. It can go outside foundation walls and go inside foundation walls. But it's usually installed in, of course, large flat plane situations where you can just put a bunch of them up. So they're very lightweight. They're very easy to work with. Sometimes it's a good choice if you have a project you're doing. You don't want to deal with like materials that are kind of annoying to work with and secure. The foam boards are very easy to secure because they're just boards and you can use hardware, different kinds and glues and stuff like that. So that's generally what they are. There are 3 types. There are from the lowest R value of R4 per inch, expanded polystyrene. This is pretty much if you think of maybe like packaging products, like you buy a computer, it comes in a box, it's going to have white foam in it. And it's like a chunk of some shaped white foam. It's like a bunch of little white bubbles, little white dots, right? That have all been expanded into a certain shape. That is expanded polystyrene. And they do make it in big, 4 foot by 8 foot sheets for the same, basically the same process, just for construction purposes for insulating. So it's basically the entry level expanded polystyrene. And then there's extruded polystyrene, which is going to look a little bit different. It's going to look a lot smoother. It can be a variety of different colors. Color doesn't really matter a lot, but its R value is a little bit higher, R5 per inch. But one of the disadvantages of extruded polystyrene is that it does lose some R value over time. And then there's my personal favorite, because I've not had to deal with super cold climates, is polyisocyanurate, usually called polyiso. I believe the other abbreviation is PIR. And it's the best R value per inch. And the additional benefit is usually this product is encased in 2 layers of foil. So it's going to have a foil layer on both sides of it, which does multiple things. It makes it a much more sturdy product because now you have foam on the inside and a kind of a tensile strength layer on the outside, which makes it much stiffer. You're less likely to break it when you're installing it. It's much likely to last a lot longer. And the foil facing allows you to do a lot of other things too. So the foil facing allows you to insert a layer in your wall that is a radiative heat transfer barrier that will reflect electromagnetic radiation or part of it, depending on how you have things set up. So that's a really cool thing. You do have to keep in mind that foil is a vapor impermeable layer. Vapor cannot get through a metal foil. So you got to make sure you don't trap moisture in your walls when you do this. Make sure you're doing things correctly. But I like polyiso for that reason. And this is the only weird thing about polyiso is that when it gets really cold, like below 15 degrees Celsius, it starts to basically not function hardly at all, which is interesting because, it's an interesting premise of my insulation needs to stay warm in order to work. That's kind of an odd thing. So that's polyiso. So thermal bridging. When you are building a house, your house is framed usually out of wood, right? And you're going to have studs everywhere. You're going to have columns in your walls everywhere. You're going to have corner boards. You're going to have all this extra wood in your walls. And all that wood that's connecting, because a regular wall is going to be your studs. And then outside the studs is going to be some kind of wood sheathing, usually. Inside the studs is going to be the sheetrock, right? So that's effectively your main wall. Your insulation is going to go between all your studs. And so instead of there being a big air cavity, there's going to be a cavity that's insulation. Well, when the heat's trying to get through your wall, it's going to your wall is not built just out of the insulation. You have studs at least every 16 inches on center, maybe 24 inches on center. And everywhere there's wood, there's less insulation. So if you have a regular 2x4 wall, and wood usually insulates around R1 per inch. So you have basically a value of R3.5 in a 2x4 stud wall. And the rest of the wall, if you put just like fiberglass in it, is R13. So everywhere you have fiberglass is R13, and everywhere you have a stud, it's R3.5. And what that does is when you have a whole bunch of studs is it lowers the average effective R value of your whole wall. So it's just something to keep in mind. And when I go into the advanced framing course later, that's where you can learn about, well, how do we reduce the amount of wood we're putting in the wall so that we have a better insulation value. That's the basic premise. So vaulted ceilings. Vaulted ceilings, I added this in here because occasionally this can be an interesting trade-off. I've seen this go different ways on different house builds. But there's the first thing to think about is the structural requirement of a vaulted ceiling. So obviously there's going to be rafters or something up above this vaulted ceiling that are the roof surface. And the thickness, like the depth of those rafters, first of all, whatever the structural requirement of the span and the spacing is, everything like that. Okay, well, you got to meet that first so it doesn't, bend or fall down or anything. So if there's a certain depth that's required, that's that. Let's say the depth was only you needed 2x6s, 24 inches on center. You're fine. It wasn't a big span. Okay. Well, then you got to think about your insulation requirement. So generally speaking, you want to have at least like an R30, and you got to check the code for your local area because everybody's, codes are different for insulation requirements. But let's say you need an R30 or an R38 in your ceiling. Then you basically, if it's a large enough area, then you can't get away with a slight deviation. So the code allows for, if it's a small portion of your house, there's a percentage. I don't remember the percentage. If there's a small portion of your house that has this vaulted ceiling, then the code allows you to not have to meet the minimum ceiling requirement in that one area because it's a small area. It's like 25% or something like that. I don't remember. All right. But in general, that's an exception to allow you to basically get away with it and have a lesser insulating vaulted ceiling. But it's like, that doesn't sound like a good idea, right? You don't really want, usually it's like a living room, a main space of the house. You don't want your main space of the house to, like, when it's hot in the summer, to have that room be hot because the insulation is not very good in the ceiling. So you have to think about, okay, well, if my rafters are 2x6s, what type of insulation might I want to use in that one spot? Maybe I'm going to use a closed cell spray foam in order to not have to spend more money on wood and complicate the framing to make those things bigger in order to fit more insulation in. Maybe I'll just use a better insulating per inch product in that one spot. Maybe not, who knows? So you kind of got to balance those things. And then of course the ventilation requirements, you got to pay attention. In a vaulted ceiling, if you're going to fill that cavity with insulation, you still need ventilation below that roof deck. So the usual way this happens, the cheap way this happens, is if you're just throwing fiberglass bats in or something like that. There's these like foam spacers you basically buy that are just these big platforms that you like staple up to the bottom of the sheathing that keeps a small air gap between the insulation and the back of the sheathing, so that air can still ventilate up the roof deck. So the drawback to that is if you do that, you're not actually going to get the full R value of the insulation because but you're basically compressing some of the insulation to make room for this ventilation. So there's kind of a trade-off there, but it is what it is. If you want to learn more about insulation, there's plenty more to learn on the magnificent source of information called the interwebs. And a great place to start would be watching the YouTube Spec House series, episode 104 by Essential Craftsman, where they insulate his spec house. You ought to watch the YouTube video, How to Choose the Best Insulation for Your Home DIY home renovation by Home Renovation DIY, and watch the YouTube video 6 Common Types of Insulation on the Market by the Build Show Network. Thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next one. Once we got our insulation in our walls, we are ready to start covering things up and make our house look sort of finished. So I'm excited. Let's do it.